The morning sunlight filtered through St. Michael's stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across worn wooden pews and hushed faces. Pastor James Carson stood at the pulpit, his familiar voice rising and falling with the cadence of his Sunday sermon. The congregation sat in their usual places, Mrs. Peterson in the front row with her immaculate floral hat, the Anderson family in their third-row pew, and elderly Mr. Roberts nodding off in his corner seat, just as he had every Sunday for the past 30 years. Then came the creak of the heavy oak doors. The sound itself wasn't unusual. Latecomers often slipped in during the sermon, but what followed made Pastor James's words die in his throat. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by a shaft of golden light, was 7-year-old Sarah Matthews. Her yellow dress was wrinkled, her white socks uneven, and her usually neat braids were coming undone. But it wasn't her disheveled appearance that caused the collective intake of breath from the congregation. It was what she carried in her arms, a bundle of pale blue blankets, held with the careful precision of someone bearing the most precious cargo in the world. As Sarah stepped forward, the bundle shifted, and a tiny cry echoed through the sanctuary. "Dear Lord," Mrs. Peterson whispered, rising from her seat. Her hat tilted precariously as she leaned forward, squinting to confirm what her eyes were telling her. The baby cried again, louder this time, a sound that could not be mistaken for anything else. Sarah adjusted her hold, supporting the infant's head just so, her small face a mask of determination, despite the dark circles under her eyes. Her shoes scuffed against the carpet as she made her way down the center aisle, each step deliberate and careful. Pastor James set his Bible down with trembling hands. In 20 years of ministry, he'd never seen anything quite like this. Where was Karen Matthews, Sarah's mother? She hadn't been to church in weeks, not since losing her job at the factory. Yet here was her daughter, alone, carrying what appeared to be a newborn baby. Sarah, his voice caught as he stepped down from the pulpit. "Sweetheart, what's happening?" The little girl stopped in the middle of the aisle. Her chin quivered, but when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "Please," she said, looking straight at Pastor James with eyes too old for her young face. "Please help us." She was too scared to come herself, but I promised her the church would help. "That's what you always say, isn't it? That's what Jesus would do." The baby whimpered, and Sarah swayed gently, shushing it with the instinctive movements of a mother. Except she wasn't a mother, she was a 7-year-old child who should have been carrying dolls, not real infants. Yet here she stood, this tiny figure in her rumpled Sunday best, challenging them all with her simple faith in their compassion. From the third row came a choked sound. Mrs. Anderson had gone deathly pale, her hand clutching her husband's arm as she stared at the bundle in Sarah's arms, and suddenly the air in St. Michael's Church grew thick with the weight of unspoken questions and a truth that was about to change them all. Karen Matthews hadn't always struggled to keep food on the table. There was a time when she could afford to buy Sarah new shoes before the old ones developed holes, when their apartment's heating worked reliably, and when she didn't have to choose between paying the electric bill and filling her daughter's prescription for asthma medication. But that was before Riverside Manufacturing closed its doors without warning, leaving Karen and 300 other workers unemployed in a town where factory jobs were already scarce. Sarah understood more than a 7-year-old should about their situation. She noticed how her mother's smile grew strained when she asked for new colored pencils for school, how the mac and cheese appeared more frequently at dinner, and how Karen would sometimes skip meals entirely. Claiming she'd already eaten when Sarah knew she hadn't, the little girl had learned to be smaller in her needs, to make her clothes last longer, to never complain about the cold that crept through their thin walls at night. But it wasn't all hardship. They had each other, and they had Lisa Anderson from next door, or at least, they used to. The teenager had been a constant presence in their lives ever since Sarah could remember, babysitting when Karen worked late shifts and helping Sarah with her homework. Lisa was 16, with a warm laugh and gentle hands that could braid Sarah's hair into elaborate styles that made her feel like a princess. "You're my honorary little sister," Lisa would say, adjusting Sarah's braids with careful fingers. Sometimes God gives us the family we need in unexpected places. Sarah treasured these moments, especially after Lisa's visits became less frequent 3 months ago. The teenager grew quiet, withdrawn. She stopped coming over to help with homework or to share the cookies she loved to bake. Sarah would see her sometimes, hurrying between her parents' apartment and her car, wearing oversized hoodies even as spring turned warm. Karen noticed too. "The Andersons' girl isn't herself lately," she'd murmured one evening, watching through their kitchen window as Lisa rushed past. "I hope she's okay." Then came last night. Sarah had been unable to sleep, worried about the past due notice she'd seen her mother trying to hide. The red letters spelling final warning had seemed to glow in the dim light of their kitchen. Through her bedroom window, she heard muffled crying from the alley behind their apartment building. Curiosity drew her to peek through the curtains. There, illuminated by the flickering security light, was Lisa. She was sitting on an overturned milk crate, cradling something in her arms. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Sarah didn't think twice. She slipped on her worn sneakers and tiptoed to their back door, easing it open carefully to avoid the squeak that always gave her away when she tried to sneak midnight snacks. The spring air was cool against her Pokémon pajamas as she padded down the metal fire escape. "Lisa," she whispered. The teenager's head snapped up, fear flashing across her tear-stained face. "Sarah, go back inside, honey. It's late." But Sarah had already seen what Lisa was holding: a tiny baby, no bigger than her favorite stuffed bear, wrapped in pale blue blankets. The infant's face was scrunched and red, making little mewling sounds that weren't quite cries. "Is that?" Sarah's voice trailed off as she moved closer. Lisa's composure crumbled. "I didn't know what to do," she choked out. "My parents, they don't know. Nobody knows. I thought I could handle it, but she won't stop crying and I can't. Sarah reached out, touching the baby's cheek with gentle fingers. The skin was softer than anything she'd ever felt. "Does she have a name?" "Hope," Lisa whispered. "I've been calling her Hope." The name seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah thought about her mother, about how she never gave up hope, even when things were hardest. She thought about Pastor James's sermons about having faith in difficult times. "You need help," Sarah said simply. "The church helps people. Pastor James always says so." Lisa shook her head violently. "I can't. My parents are there every Sunday. Everyone would judge me. They'd all look at me and see she couldn't finish the sentence." Sarah watched as baby Hope squirmed in her blankets, one tiny fist escaping to wave in the air. She remembered what Lisa had said about God giving us the family we need. Maybe this was why she'd found them tonight. Maybe she was meant to be the help Lisa needed. "Show me how to hold her," Sarah said firmly. "What?" "Show me how to hold her properly. And how to feed her and everything else. If you're too scared to go to church, I'll take her. Pastor James will know what to do." "Sarah, no, you can't." "You're my honorary big sister," Sarah interrupted, using Lisa's own words. "And that makes Hope family too. Family helps family." Tears spilled down Lisa's cheeks as she looked at this small girl in Pokémon pajamas, offering help with the pure, uncomplicated faith of childhood. Slowly, carefully, she began to demonstrate how to support Hope's head, how to hold the bottle just right, how to check if she was too hot or cold. As the security light flickered above them, Sarah listened and learned, memorizing every detail. She didn't know exactly how she would manage it, but she knew with absolute certainty that when morning came, she would walk into St. Michael's Church with baby Hope in her arms. Someone had to be brave enough to ask for help, and if Lisa couldn't do it, Sarah would do it for her. The night stretched endless before Sarah as she sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, baby Hope cradled in her lap. The old digital clock on her nightstand blinked 1:47 a.m. in harsh red numbers, casting a faint glow across the room. Her mother's soft snores drifted through the thin walls. Karen had come home exhausted from another day of job hunting, falling asleep without noticing her daughter's quiet vigil. Sarah's mind wandered back to just hours before, to that moment in the alley that had changed everything. "I never meant for this to happen," Lisa had whispered, her words barely audible over the distant sound of traffic. She'd shown Sarah how to mix the formula, hands shaking as she demonstrated the proper measurements. I thought I could handle it alone. Be brave enough, strong enough." The teenager's voice had cracked on the last word, and Sarah had reached out to squeeze her hand, the way her mother did when Sarah was scared. "You don't have to be alone," she'd said with the simple wisdom of childhood. That's what church is for. Remember when Tommy's dad lost his job and everyone brought food? Or when Mrs. Peterson's house flooded and the whole congregation helped clean up? Lisa had managed a weak smile, though fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. This is different, Sarah. People. They look at girls like me and see only mistakes. My parents haven't even noticed they're so busy with church committees and charity work. Always helping everyone else, she touched Hope's cheek with trembling fingers. How do I tell them their perfect daughter got pregnant? That I was so scared I hid it for months, wore big sweaters, made excuses. Sarah had watched as Hope's tiny fingers curled around Lisa's thumb. But you're still their daughter. And this is their granddaughter. Isn't that what Pastor James says about God's love? That it doesn't stop even when we make mistakes. Now, in the quiet of her room, Sarah adjusted the blanket around Hope just as Lisa had shown her. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her breath coming in soft puffs against Sarah's arm. A notepad lay beside them, covered in Sarah's careful second-grade handwriting. Feed every 3 hours. Check diaper lots. Keep head supported. Rock gently if crying. Burp after bottle. She'd written everything down as Lisa explained, determined not to forget a single detail. The diaper bag sat nearby, packed with everything they could gather: formula, diapers, clean blankets, and a change of clothes. Lisa had wanted to give Sarah money for a taxi to the church, but Sarah had refused. You need it for Hope, she'd insisted. I can walk. I've gone to church lots of times with Mum. But she hadn't told Lisa that her church shoes pinched her growing feet, or that the walk would take nearly an hour. Some things weren't important in the face of bigger needs. 2:15 a.m. Hope began to fuss, her face scrunching up in that way that preceded a cry. Sarah quickly grabbed a prepared bottle, remembering Lisa's instructions about testing the temperature on her wrist. The formula was still warm enough. Shade, she whispered, positioning the bottle just right. We have to be quiet so Mummy doesn't wake up. She needs her sleep for job interviews. Hope's eyes opened briefly dark blue, like Lisa's before closing again as she drank. Sarah watched in fascination as tiny fingers flexed and curled against the bottle. Your mummy loves you so much, Sarah murmured. She's just scared right now, but we're going to help her be brave. 3:45 a.m. A diaper change that made Sarah's nose wrinkle, but she managed it, disposing of the evidence in the outside dumpster so her mother wouldn't find it. Her legs trembled slightly on the trip down the fire escape. She was getting tired, but she couldn't sleep. Lisa had trusted her with Hope's care, and Sarah took that responsibility as seriously as she took being line leader at school. 4:30 a.m. Another feeding, another diaper change. Sarah's arms ached from holding the baby, but she remembered Lisa's warning about supporting the head. She practiced standing and walking around her room, getting used to the weight, preparing for the journey ahead. 5:15 a.m. The sky outside her window began to lighten, turning from black to deep blue. Sarah changed into her yellow Sunday dress, the one her mother had found at the thrift store. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons. She was so tired, but she managed it. Church started at 9 a.m., but she needed to leave early to make it on time. I'll fix my hair at church, she decided, looking at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her braids were coming undone, but that didn't matter. What mattered was getting Hope there safely. 6 a.m. Sarah wrote a note to her mother in her best handwriting. Dear Mummy, don't worry. I went to church early to help with something important. I'll tell you everything later. I love you, Sarah. She placed it on the kitchen counter where Karen would be sure to see it when she woke up. Then, with utmost care, she gathered Hope into her arms and the diaper bag over her shoulder. The early morning air was cool as Sarah began her walk. Her church shoes pinched with every step, but she kept going, watching the sunrise paint the sky in pinks and golds. Cars passed occasionally, but no one paid attention to a little girl in a yellow dress. They couldn't see that she carried the weight of trust and hope in her arms, couldn't know that every step brought her closer to fulfilling a promise. Hope stayed remarkably quiet during their journey, as if she understood the importance of their mission. When she did begin to fuss, Sarah would stop in the shade of a tree or building, checking the diaper or offering the bottle she'd prepared before leaving. Her arms trembled with fatigue, but she remembered Lisa's words about proper support and adjusted her hold accordingly. "We're almost there," she whispered as St. Michael's steeple came into view. "Just a little further." The church grounds were quiet when she arrived, early morning dew still clinging to the grass. Sarah sat on the steps, feeding hope one last time before the congregation would arrive. Her whole body ached with exhaustion, and her dress was wrinkled from the long walk, but none of that mattered. As she heard cars beginning to pull into the parking lot, Sarah stood up carefully. Hope was sleeping peacefully, one tiny hand curled against the blanket. Sarah thought about Lisa, probably sick with worry, and about the Andersons, who didn't yet know they were grandparents. She thought about her own mother, who had taught her that love meant helping others even when things were hard. The first churchgoers were ascending the steps now, giving her curious looks. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her small shoulders. She had promised Lisa she would find help, and now she would keep that promise. With steps that trembled only slightly, she approached the heavy wooden doors of St. Michael's Church, ready to show them all what faith and love truly meant. "Lisa's baby," Mrs. Anderson's voice shattered the sanctuary's silence. She gripped the back of the pew, her knuckles white. "What do you mean, Lisa's baby?" Sarah held Hope closer, her tired arms trembling but steadfast. "She needs her family," she repeated softly. "Both of them do." Mr. Anderson stood frozen, his usual stern expression crumbling into something raw and vulnerable. That's impossible. Lisa would have told us. We would have known." Pastor James moved closer to Sarah, his eyes filled with understanding. "How long have you been helping her, Sarah?" "Just since last night," Sarah's voice quavered. "But she's been scared for so long. She wears big sweaters and stays in her room, and cries when she thinks nobody can hear her." She looked directly at the Andersons, her young face earnest. "She thinks you won't love her anymore." Mrs. Anderson stumbled forward, a strangled sob escaping her throat. "Not love her? She's our baby." The church doors burst open again. Lisa stood in the doorway, her face pale and tear-stained, still wearing the clothes from the night before. "Sarah," she cried out, "I went to your apartment, but you were gone, and I thought her eyes found her parents," and she froze. Lisa, Mrs. Anderson breathed her daughter's name like a prayer. The teenager's hands flew protectively to her stomach, a habit now useless with her secret cradled in Sarah's arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I was going to tell you. But then weeks passed, and I got more scared. And..." "Why?" Mr. Anderson's voice cracked. "Why didn't you come to us?" "Because you're the perfect church family." Lisa's words erupted in a sob. "You lead committees and organize charity drives, and everyone looks up to you. And I messed up. I didn't want to ruin everything." Mrs. Peterson stood up suddenly, her floral hat quivering. "Perfect. James Anderson, do you remember when you were 17 and crashed your father's car street racing? And Martha, wasn't it you who got caught shoplifting makeup when you were 15? A murmur ran through the congregation. Mr. Anderson's face flushed. "That was different." But was it? Pastor James's quiet voice carried authority. "We all make mistakes, especially when we're young and scared. The question isn't whether we stumble, it's who helps us back to our feet." Sarah's legs were shaking now, exhaustion taking its toll. Pastor James noticed and quickly brought a chair, helping her sit while still cradling Hope. The baby chose that moment to wake, letting out a small cry that seemed to pierce straight through Lisa's heart. The teenager moved forward instinctively, then stopped, looking uncertainly at her parents. Mrs. Anderson reached out and grasped her daughter's hand. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me my granddaughter." Lisa's sob of relief echoed through the sanctuary as she rushed to Sarah's side. With gentle hands, she lifted Hope from Sarah's tired arms, turning to face her parents. "Her name is Hope," she said softly. "I've been calling her Hope." Mr. Anderson moved closer, his steps hesitant. The baby gurgled, one tiny hand reaching up toward his face. "She has your eyes," he said hoarsely, "just like when you were born." The wall of silence that had surrounded the Andersons began to crack. Mrs. Peterson was the first to approach, followed by others from the congregation. Words of support and offers of help began to flow: baby clothes saved from grandchildren, offers of babysitting, recommendations for support services. "I don't deserve this," Lisa whispered, watching as her mother gently traced Hope's cheek. "Love isn't about deserving," Sarah said, fighting to keep her eyes open. "That's what you always told me. Sometimes God gives us the family we need in unexpected places. Lisa's tears fell freely as she recognized her own words. She knelt beside Sarah's chair, still holding hope. You walked all the way here, didn't you? Carrying her all by yourself. Someone had to be brave, Sarah said simply. And you couldn't be brave by yourself yet, so I helped. Pastor James cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. Out of the mouths of babes, he said softly. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us what faith really means. Not perfect people who never make mistakes, but imperfect people who help each other through the hard times. Mrs. Anderson wrapped her arms around Lisa and Hope, and after a moment's hesitation, Mr. Anderson joined them. The family stood wrapped in their first embrace in months, their tears falling freely now, not tears of shame or fear, but of relief and reconciliation. The congregation watched in reverent silence as years of judgment and pretense melted away, replaced by the simple truth that Sarah had known all along: love was bigger than mistakes, and family, whether by blood or by choice, meant never having to face your struggles alone. And in the midst of it all, Sarah finally allowed her tired eyes to close, knowing she had kept her promise. She had found help, not just for Lisa and Hope, but for an entire community that had forgotten what it meant to love without judgment. In the weeks that followed that fateful Sunday morning, St. Michael's Church underwent a transformation that went far beyond its physical spaces. The unused room behind the sanctuary, once storage for forgotten Christmas decorations and dusty hymnals, became Hope's Haven, a support center for young mothers and struggling families. Mrs. Peterson, with her organizational skills honed from 30 years of teaching Sunday school, took charge of coordinating donations. Baby clothes, diapers, and supplies began appearing daily. The ancient desktop computer in the church office was replaced with a new one, courtesy of Mr. Roberts's tech-savvy grandson, creating a job search station for parents seeking employment. It's not charity, Pastor James would say during planning meetings, it's community. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the reminder that no one has to struggle alone. Lisa's story had opened more than just hearts, it had opened eyes. Other young women in the congregation began sharing their own struggles, their own fears. Every confession of need was met not with judgment, but with practical support and understanding. The perfect facade of suburban church life cracked, revealing something far more valuable: authentic human connection. Karen Matthews discovered this firsthand one Wednesday evening, when she arrived to pick up Sarah from the new after-school program the church had started. Mrs. Anderson, who had taken to spending her afternoons at Hope's Haven when not doting on her granddaughter, caught her arm. Karen, wait, she said, her eyes bright with purpose. You used to work in manufacturing quality control, didn't you? Karen nodded, trying to hide her surprise at being addressed by one of the church's most prominent members. For 12 years at Riverside, before they closed. My sister's company is looking for a QC supervisor. They need someone with floor experience who can train new staff. Mrs. Anderson pressed a business card into Karen's hand. The pay is better than Riverside, and they offer childcare benefits. I told her about you, about how you've raised such an extraordinary daughter on your own. Karen's fingers trembled as they closed around the card. I don't know what to say. Say you'll interview. Sarah's shown us all what it means to help without hesitation. It's time we followed her example. The interview led to a job offer, and suddenly the Matthews world shifted. No more choosing between bills, no more skipped meals, no more worn-out shoes. Sarah watched her mother's shoulders straighten, the worry lines around her eyes softening. But perhaps the most profound transformation happened in the Anderson household. The perfect facade of their family life had crumbled, replaced by something real and raw and beautiful. Lisa moved back home with Hope, her childhood bedroom transformed into a nursery painted in soft yellows and greens. The sound of her baby's laughter became a regular melody in the house, harmonizing with the gentle humming of Mrs. Anderson as she rocked her granddaughter. Mr. Anderson, who had always hidden behind his stern church elder persona, discovered the joy of being called Grandpa. He could often be found in his workshop, crafting tiny wooden toys for Hope while reconciling with his new role and the lessons it had taught him about grace. I spent so many years trying to be perfect, he confessed to Pastor James one evening. Trying to make my family perfect. I never realized that our imperfections might be where God's love shines through the brightest. Lisa flourished under her parents' support attending community college classes while her mother eagerly watched Hope. The teenage mother who had once hidden in oversized hoodies now stood tall, sharing her story with other young women who came to Hope's Haven seeking guidance. And Sarah? She became a bridge between worlds, spending afternoons helping Lisa with Hope or assisting Mrs. Peterson with the younger children at the support center. Her simple act of courage had sparked a revolution of compassion that continued to ripple outward. One Sunday, 6 months after that transformative morning, Pastor James invited Sarah to help him deliver the sermon. She stood beside him at the pulpit, her yellow dress replaced by a new blue one that actually fit, her shoes no longer pinching her toes. "Sarah," he asked her before the congregation, "what made you so sure the church would help that morning?" She thought for a moment, her answer carrying clearly through the sanctuary, because that's what family does. And church isn't just a building, it's the biggest family of all. From her usual pew, Lisa smiled through happy tears, bouncing Hope on her knee. The baby, now sitting up and grabbing at everything within reach, wore a tiny dress made from fabric donated by Mrs. Peterson. Beside them, the Andersons sat close, their faces soft with love as they watched their daughter and granddaughter. Karen Matthews, dressed in her new work clothes, caught her daughter's eye and winked. Their struggles weren't over. Life would always have its challenges, but they were no longer facing them alone. The support center continued to grow, its services expanding to meet the community's needs. What had begun with one small girl's determination to help her friend had blossomed into a network of support that touched countless lives. Other churches in the area began to take notice, reaching out to learn how they too could better serve their communities. "It's amazing," Lisa said one afternoon, watching Sarah play peekaboo with Hope. "How one person choosing love over judgment can change so many lives." Sarah looked up, her smile as bright as ever. "That's because love grows bigger when you share it. Like Hope's Haven, it started with helping you, but now it helps everybody." And in that simple truth lay the heart of their story, not just of a 7-year-old's brave walk to church with a baby in her arms, but of how that walk had led an entire community back to its true purpose, being a family to all who needed one. 1 year after Sarah's fateful walk to St. Michael's Church, Hope celebrated her first birthday in the community center that bore her name. Hope's Haven had grown beyond anyone's expectations, serving not just their congregation, but the entire community. The once empty room now buzzed with life, its walls decorated with children's artwork and photos of families whose lives had been touched by its programs. Sarah, now 8, sat cross-legged on the floor with Hope in her lap, helping the toddler unwrap presents. The baby who had once fit so perfectly in her arms now wobbled on sturdy legs, her dark curls bouncing as she giggled. Lisa watched them from nearby, her college textbooks stacked beside her, pride shining in her eyes as she saw her daughter flourishing under the love of their extended church family. "You know," Pastor James said, addressing the gathered celebration, "we often talk about faith moving mountains. But sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to show us that the mountain isn't as high as we thought." Sarah didn't see impossibilities that morning. She saw someone who needed help, and she provided it without hesitation or judgment. But Karen Matthews, now supervisor at her new job, squeezed her daughter's shoulder. The Andersons stood nearby, their formerly perfect facade replaced by genuine joy as they watched their granddaughter play. In the end, the greatest miracle wasn't just Hope's rescue or the families saved by the outreach program. It was the transformation of hearts that had forgotten a simple truth that love, in its purest form, doesn't ask if someone deserves help, it simply helps. And sometimes it takes a child's unwavering faith to remind us all what it means to truly be a family in Christ. Hope toddled over to Sarah, wrapping tiny arms around her honorary aunt's neck, and in that embrace was everything that mattered: love, acceptance, and the kind of faith that moves not mountains, but hearts.